The History of the Harrietenberg and its Environs. Part 6. The War of Frau Brown's Cow. Immediately after the Battle of Negroni, Admiral Pisello transferred the surviving crew of the Campari to the empty hold of the Rosa, and replaced them with a skeleton crew drawn from the Cavatappi and the Carafa. Captain Martini and the other officers of the Campari were transferred to the Cavatappi, where they were subject to supervision but treated as gentlemen. Makeshift repairs were made to the Carafa over the remainder of that day, and the following day she sailed back to Panini with the 2 captured ships. The Cavatappi's crew had needed to plug a few holes in her hull, caused by cannonballs fired from the Campari, but she was in a fit state to remain on station and continued to enforce the blockade. 2 days after the battle, a small ship flying a white flag sailed out of Negroni harbour, down the Schniffel estuary, and came alongside the Cavatappi. The master of Negroni climbed from this ship up onto the deck of the Cavatappi and handed Admiral Pisello a letter. This letter was from the Senate, and accepted in full the demands of King Leonardo XIII. A week later, Crown Prince Leonardo arrived in Negroni aboard the Campari, which was now flying the flag of Panini, having been recommissioned as the 3rd ship in the navy of His Majesty King Leonardo XIII. He came ashore, accompanied by Captain Gelato and the King's skirmishers, and was welcomed by the Magister, who escorted him to the Senate building, where the Senate was in session. The Senate acclaimed him as the new Magister of Negroni, appointed him in that capacity for life, and then passed a motion disbanding itself. A week later, the Flamingo came into port with a hold full of cargo. Her owner made a lot of money, and her captain made some. The people of Negroni braced themselves for a regime of feudal cruelty and oppression, but they were disappointed. Crown Prince Leonardo had an audience with Captain Ponzi and Colonel Ragionieri, who were asked to swear an oath of loyalty to him. Having done so, they continued in their current roles. True, the Negroni Cannoneers, a branch of the military in which Crown Prince Leonardo took considerable interest, was renamed as the 2nd Battery of the King's Artillery, the king in question, of course, being King Leonardo XIII of Panini. But the battery retained its officers, and the men their purple uniforms. Neither did the new Magister make any administrative or legislative changes, other than opening the port of Negroni to the merchants of Panini. But the port of Panini was also opened to the merchants of Negroni, who were therefore able to participate in the cedar squirrel fur trade. Neither did the new Magister increase tax rates, although he did not lower them. The funds which in past times would have been spent on the navy and on providing lavish catering for the meetings of the Senate were instead sent to Panini. The net result of all this was that trade increased at both Negroni and Panini. This benefited the merchants of Negroni, who increased their profits. The greater volume of trade also benefited the treasury of Negroni, as it resulted in an increased tax take. And this benefited King Leonardo XIII of Panini, as most of the resulting surplus was transferred to his coffers. So everyone was happy. Although the king's skirmishers remained in Negroni, they kept a low profile, restricted to guard duty at the Senate building, which had been occupied by Crown Prince Leonardo and renamed as the Magister's Palace. And the Magister's Palace was the scene of much gaiety. The tax surplus that was not remitted to Panini was used by the Magister to fund grandiose balls at his new residence. Now, many of the merchants of Negroni had daughters of a marriageable age, and these young ladies regularly attended these balls, where the magister, who was tolerably good-looking, rich, titled, powerful and single, paid them all special attention. There was much speculation as to which of these fair damsels would win his heart. The Crown Prince Leonardo was not alone in being wealthy, heir to a title, single, and reputedly seeking a spouse. To the north of Harrietten lay the Duchy of SOISSAGE. The Duke de SOISSAGE had no interest in marriage. He was an aged widower who spent most of his time at the card table. He only played for high stakes, which, as SOISSAGE was a fertile and productive territory, he could afford to lose. This was not always true of those that he played against, but I have heard it said that the Duke was happy to accept payment for gambling debts in the form of certain personal services, rather than in coin. The Duke had a single child, a son. This son was formerly known as the Ducal Prince de SOISSAGE, among many other complicated and impressive-sounding titles, but he was known to all as the Duckling de SOISSAGE. He had inherited none of his father's elegance and charm, but all of his father's vices, which he had supplemented with some vices of his very own. Becoming bored of all these pursuits, and seeking novel diversions, the Duckling de SOISSAGE's thoughts turned to marriage. It is rumoured that several of the aristocratic young ladies of the Duchy of SOISSAGE rejected proposals from the Duckling. I do not know if such proposals were actually made, or why they might have been rejected. Although he was partial to cream cakes, the Duckling did not perspire excessively for one of his extensive bulk, and I believe that beneath his copious flesh there may have lurked a handsome bone structure. The Duckling's little habits were well known in SOISSAGE, and it was widely discussed that his personal staff included both a pastry chef and a pox doctor. While having unfettered access to the former might have attracted those potential spouses who shared the Duckling's love of patisserie, it may be that his employment of the latter deterred those nuptial candidates who anticipated that any marriage would have to be consummated. Whatever the reason, the Duckling de SOISSAGE let it be known that he had determined to travel, having tired of the entertainment to be obtained in his own land. The first stop on his grand tour was Harrietten. Upon arriving in Harrietten, the Duckling installed himself in an opulent townhouse and soon fell into a routine. He spent the mornings sleeping. Arising in the early afternoon, he would complete his toilet and take a leisurely breakfast consisting of eclairs and cherry brandy. He would then clamber into his reinforced sedan chair, which would be carried by two muscular young men around the more fashionable areas of the city, so that he could fulfil his many social engagements. His evenings were typically spent at the opera, and he would return home immediately following the performance. How he occupied himself before retiring I do not know, although it was observed that the lights burned late. The Countess Harriet von Harrietten would regularly summon the Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz to her presence, in order to discuss military matters and other subjects of mutual interest. Having received such a summons, the Grand Marshal proceeded to Harrietten Castle. On arrival, he was usually admitted immediately to the Countess' reception room. However, on this occasion, he was informed that the Countess was currently occupied and asked to wait in an antechamber. He had been waiting, increasingly impatiently, for some considerable time, when the doors to the reception room were opened and the Duckling de SOISSAGE waddled out. The Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz bowed, as was required by etiquette when a mere baron, even though he may also be a Grand Marshal, encounters a ducal prince. The duckling did not see fit to acknowledge this genuflection. It was a somewhat irritated Grand Marshal who was subsequently ushered into the reception room. The Countess Harriet von Harrietten allowed him to kiss her hand, and asked for his opinion of the duckling de Soissage. "I think that he is a fat fool," stated the Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz. The Countess smiled. "I should inform you," she said, "that the duckling has just asked me to marry him." "What a ridiculous idea!" laughed the Grand Marshal. "I thought he was looking somewhat distracted earlier. How did he take it when you refused him?" "I did not refuse him," said the Countess. "But why on earth would you want to marry a half-witted, dissolute, pox-ridden libertine?" asked the Grand Marshal. "If he were his father, I would suggest that he had won you at cards. But the duckling does not have his father's skill at the table, so that cannot be the answer." This was maybe not the most tactful thing that the Grand Marshal could have said at this point. "I did not refuse him," said the Countess, "because marrying him would make me, in due course, the Duchess of Soissage, and combining the territories of Harrietten and Soissage would create the most powerful state on this side of the sea." "Marrying the duckling is a high price to pay for Soissage," observed the Grand Marshal. "When I delivered Kleinplatz to you, I did not ask for your hand in return." The Countess looked at him pityingly. "I do believe you are jealous," she said. "Kleinplatz is hardly Soissage, is it? But at least Kleinplatz exists, which is more than can apparently be said of Spankowitz. You would do well to remember your place and who has put you there." The Grand Marshal bowed, apologised, and asked for the Countess' forgiveness. "When is the happy occasion?" he then inquired. The Countess shrugged. "I did not say that I had accepted his proposal," she said, "only that I did not refuse him. A woman likes to be wooed, and these things take time." The Grand Marshal turned the conversation to military matters. The battery of cannon he had promised the Countess had been constructed and gunners recruited, but they needed some training, and it would be helpful for the rest of the army to learn how to operate in conjunction with the artillery. He suggested taking the cannon and some other selected units of the army on manoeuvres in the wide open spaces of the Foldenwalden, where they could get some practice in without the risk of damaging too much private property, and be unseen by prying eyes. The Countess Harriet von Harrietten assented to this suggestion. The Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz lost no time in organising these manoeuvres. Colonel Radek and the 1st Company of Buttercups were summoned from Kleinplatz. Captain Tottenkopf and the 1st Company of Sharpshooters from Schurden, and Colonel Toltot and all 3 squadrons of the Pink Hussars from Flumpfen, where they were currently stationed. The Grand Marshal then paid a visit to Colonel Dunkelgelb's club, where he found that gentleman in the smoking room, armed with a large cigar, and working his way through a bottle of fortified wine. The Grand Marshal informed the Colonel that the Golden Guard was required for military manoeuvres, which would involve several days of hard marching up and down the hills of the Foldenwalden and sleeping in the field. The Colonel immediately suggested that it would be useful experience for Major Beerslopper to take command of the regiment for this exercise, and that the Colonel's presence would only distract the Major from his task. The Grand Marshal agreed to this proposal. 10 days after his audience with the Countess Harriet von Harrietten, the Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz led the forces he had assembled out of Harrietten on the road to Flumpfen. After a few miles, the column took a right turn onto the North Road, skirting the western flanks of the Harrietenberg. The Grand Marshal chose not to approach the Fulden-Walden by way of Gappen, but remained on the North Road, marching his men through Sprangen and on towards Fulden. About 15 miles south of Fulden, the most westward finger of the Fulden-Walden extends down to the North Road, and it was widely anticipated by his men that, at this point, the Grand Marshal would lead the column off the main road and head eastward into the hills. But he did not, and so it was that 6 days after leaving Harrietten, the troops reached Fulden, where they pitched camp a couple of miles outside the town. The Grand Marshal issued orders that no one was to enter the town, or indeed leave the camp, without his express permission. The only person who received such permission was Colonel Radek, who ventured into Fulden alone and returned with a cloaked and hooded companion. That evening, the Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz summoned Colonel Toltot, Major Beerslopper, and Captain Tottenkopf to a meeting. Entering a large tent that had been erected for this purpose, they found the Grand Marshal in conversation with Colonel Radek and a full-figured female. "Good evening, gentlemen," said the Grand Marshal. "This is Frau Braun." Frau Braun smiled. Although she was maybe past the first bloom of youth, this smile caused Major Beerslopper to blush and Colonel Toltot to twirl his moustache. Captain Tottenkopf was impassive. The Grand Marshal gestured to a sideboard bearing a selection of bottles. "You may wish to fortify yourselves, gentlemen," he suggested. "Frau Braun is the bearer of disturbing tidings." Colonel Toltot walked up to Frau Braun and bowed to her. "Your tidings must have greatly disturbed the Grand Marshal," he said, "for him to so far forget his manners as to offer refreshment to the gentlemen before ensuring that your feminine needs were met. A beautiful lady must always come first. Can I interest you in something with which to moisten your charming lips?" "No, thank you, sir," fluttered Frau Braun. "The Grand Marshal has already satisfied my needs." Captain Tottenkopf raised a solitary eyebrow. "Did you say your name was Braun?" he inquired. "That is not a common name around these parts." "No," said Frau Braun. "My husband, rest his soul, was originally from Greenmead." "Last time I was in Fulden," continued Captain Tottenkopf, "I was performing various policing duties, which included closing down a house that had a certain notoriety. One of the demi-reps employed by that establishment went by the name of Fräulein Sosserkruger. You bear a remarkable resemblance to her." "Captain!" exclaimed the Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz, "this lady is a guest of mine, and you forget your manners. We do not have time for you to reminisce about all the interesting females you may have encountered in your duties, and the fact that one of them may bear a slight resemblance to Frau Braun is of no relevance whatsoever." "I apologise," said the captain, and bowed to Frau Braun. "I meant no offence." "Frau Braun is here," explained the Grand Marshal, "because she approached Colonel Radek with some most disturbing news. Her cow has been subject to an assault by subjects of a foreign power. Colonel Radek can provide more details." "Indeed," said Colonel Radek. "It appears that some SOISSAGE merchants were bringing their wares from Florette to sell them at the market in Fulden. Just as it approaches Fulden, the road from Florette passes Frau Braun's house, and Frau Brown's cow was standing in the road. Rather than ask the cow to move or navigate around it, these soissageois saw fit to seek to move the cow by throwing stones at it. When Frau Brown remonstrated with them and requested that they desist, she was subject to their mockery and abuse. "Yes," interrupted Frau Brown, "they were very disrespectful, and they did upset my poor cow. Her milk was sour for a week afterwards." "I am sure you will all agree, gentlemen," said the Grand Marshal, "that the honour of the Countess Harriet von Harrietten would be forever besmirched if this unprovoked attack on one of her subjects was ignored. Under the circumstances, it is clear that I have no option but to declare war upon the Duchy of Soissage." "Certainly," ejaculated Colonel Taltot. "The Pink Hussars will gladly shed their blood in foreign fields to defend the honour of a beautiful lady." He turned to Frau Brown. "Madam," he announced, "the manner in which you have been treated is intolerable and will be avenged." Colonel Radek smiled at Colonel Taltot. "Absolutely," he said. "It must be war." Major Beerslopper shrugged. "It is not my place to have an opinion," he said. "You are the Grand Marshal of Harrietten, and whatever you order, the Golden Guard will obey." Captain Tottenkopf looked quizzically around the group. "Sir," he inquired of the Grand Marshal, "this all seems somewhat unusual. Do you have the authority to declare war? My understanding is that only the Countess can do so." "As commander of the armed forces of Harrietten, I will, of course, take sole responsibility for my decision," stated the Grand Marshal. "And I do not think the Countess will want to be disturbed with such matters at present," he continued. "She is preoccupied, planning her wedding to the Duckling de Soissage." Captain Tottenkopf's eyes widened. "I see," he said. "I see. That wedding would not be a happy day for you, or indeed for any of the subjects of the Countess. Under the circumstances, Frau Brown's cow must certainly be avenged." Colonel Radek nodded. "War it is, then," he said. "Of course, if we are at war with Soissage, the duckling cannot be allowed to remain at liberty in Harrietten." "No," said the Grand Marshal, "he will have to be interred, and, while we are at it, I think that a search of his abode would produce enough evidence to also have him imprisoned on charges of outraging public decency." Captain Tottenkopf tilted his head. "The Countess will not be happy," he said. The Grand Marshal Baron Spankovitz grinned. "She will be happy if I deliver Soissage to her," he said. "Otherwise, well, she will not be happy, as you say. Who is your most reliable officer?" "Lieutenant Blutwurst," replied the captain. "He is to immediately ride back to Harrietten with a small detachment of sharpshooters and arrest and incarcerate the duckling," ordered the Grand Marshal. "He is then to personally hand this letter to the Countess." He handed a sealed envelope to the captain. Captain Tottenkopf took the envelope, snapped to attention, and saluted. "Yes, sir," he said. That evening, Frau Brown left the camp. She was driving a horse and cart, in the back of which was a small trunk, which had not previously been observed in her possession. According to the soldier who loaded it onto the cart for her, this trunk was very heavy. She did not head back into Fulden, but rather took the road south. I do not know if she ever returned to Fulden. Indeed, as far as I can tell, there is no record of anyone of that name ever having lived there. The following morning, the Grand Marshal marched his army through Fulden and onward into the Duchy of Soissage. On his way through Fulden, he posted a letter to the Duc de Soissage, informing him that Harrietten was now at war with the Duchy of Soissage. After all, as the Grand Marshal observed to Colonel Radek, to march into Soissage without first formally declaring war would be bad form, and that would never do. The following day, the Duc de Soissage's luncheon was disturbed by several agitated messengers, informing him that a hostile army was marching from Fulden along the main road toward the city of Soissage. It appears that the postal service between Fulden and Soissage was not particularly efficient, and so this came as a complete surprise to the Duke, who had not yet received the Grand Marshal's letter. The Duc de Soissage was not a warlike character. Etiquette demanded that he maintained an army, but this was primarily designed for ceremonial and decorative purposes, rather than for actually fighting. Nevertheless, in the current circumstances, it was apparent to the Duc de Soissage both that fighting was necessary and that no other army was available to him that he could use for this purpose. The Duke therefore roused his expensively attired troops out of their barracks and formed them up in the square in front of the ducal palace. The orders were barked, the trumpets sounded, and the lines of elegant troops in their laced-trimmed white coats, twinned with grey breeches and hats, marched through the city in perfect step, past the cheering citizens and down the road toward Fulden. The city of Soissage stood on the pretty river Soubrette, and the road to Fulden followed this effervescent tributary until it discharged into the more sedate stream of the river Schniffel. At this point the road crossed the river Schniffel by way of Fromage Bridge, and continued alongside the river Schniffel toward Fulden. The Duke determined that this bridge offered him a favourable defensive position, and it was here that he would stand and fight. The Duke therefore marched his army to Fromage Bridge, arriving on the evening of the day following his departure from Soissage, by which time the soldiers' white coats and lace trimmings had become somewhat less elegant and somewhat more bedraggled and travel-stained. The Duke's army was composed of 2 regiments of line infantry and a regiment of cavalry. The line infantry consisted of the 1st and 2nd regiments of the Fusiliers of the Grand Army of the Duchy of Soissage. Each of these regiments included a company of light infantry. The cavalry regiment was known as the Chevalier Horse Guard of the Grand Army of the Duchy of Soissage, and consisted of 2 squadrons, one of heavy cavalry and one of light cavalry, referred to respectively as the Heavy Squadron and the Light Squadron. On the Soissage side of Fromage Bridge stood the buildings of Fromage Farm. The fields of Fromage Farm ran down to the river Schniffel on each side of the bridge. The Duke stationed the 1st and 2nd Fusiliers in these fields, respectively on the right and left sides of the bridge, where both regiments could pour fire upon any troops attempting to cross. The heavy squadron of Chevaliers was stationed further back, behind the farm, from where they could move down the road and charge into any enemy troops who braved the crossfire and succeeded in crossing the bridge. On the far side of Fromage Bridge, the road ran between Chevrotin Hill to the north and Faissel Forest to the south. It then passed by the buildings and through the fields of the grandly named Chateau Chevrotin, which was in reality nothing more than a rather down-at-heel farm, and onward toward Fulden. The Duke detached the companies of light infantry from the Fusilier regiments and sent them across Fromage Bridge, accompanied by the light squadron of Chevaliers, with instructions to harry the enemy on their approach. The light infantry company of the 1st Fusiliers positioned itself south of the road, along the north edge of Fessel Forest, from where it could fire at anyone coming along the road. The light squadron of Chevaliers deployed on the north side of the road, between the foot of Chevrotin Hill and the river Schniffel. The light infantry company of the 2nd Fusiliers was positioned to the south of Fessel Forest, in reserve. The following morning the army of Harrietten arrived at Chateau Chevrotin. Along the road, at the head of the column, rode Colonel Toltot and Captain Galuska, followed by the 1st Squadron of the Pink Hussars. Behind them rode the Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz and the Harrietten artillery, with Major Beerslopper and the Golden Guard in the rear. On either side of the road, a company of light infantry moved through the fields, on the right the Buttercups under Colonel Radek, and on the left Captain Tottenkopf and his sharpshooters. Beyond the sharpshooters, the 3rd Squadron of the Pink Hussars, under the command of Captain Zerbo, rode along the bank of the river Schniffel. On the right flank, Captain Bickever led the 2nd Squadron of the Pink Hussars along the ridge of Chevrotin Hill. And it was Captain Bickever who started the proceedings. The 2nd Squadron of the Pink Hussars reached the high point of the ridge. Before them, the ridge continued down to the meadows that fringed the languid river Schniffel, and in those meadows loitered the light squadron of the Chevaliers. Captain Bickever knew what was expected of the Pink Hussars. He turned to the bugler beside him and ordered him to sound the charge, and the pink-clad ranks surged forward. Meanwhile, Colonel Toltot had advanced to a point where he could see down the road to the river, the bridge, and, beyond, to the white-clad ranks of Fusiliers arrayed beneath the colours of SOISSAGE, which were also predominantly white. "I will ride back and inform the Grand Marshal that the enemy has been sighted," he observed to Captain Galuska. "In the meantime, you are to hold your squadron here." Captain Galuska twirled his moustache. "Captain Bickever is not holding his position," he observed, pointing at Chevrotin Hill. "And I notice that the cowardly cow molesters beyond the bridge already have their white flags ready. My men will be upset if the Soissageois capitulate before we have the opportunity to cross swords with them." Colonel Toltot smiled. "That was spoken like a true Pink Hussar," he said. "But, none the less, you will stay here until you are ordered to do otherwise." And he spurred his horse back down the road. The Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz had seen Captain Bickever's squadron charge. He asked Colonel Toltot what had prompted this. The colonel informed him that he did not know, but that enemy line infantry were drawn up on the far side of the bridge, and he assumed that there would be some screening forces on this side of the river. His assumption was that Captain Bickever had spotted and intended to engage with such a unit. The Grand Marshal ordered both companies of light infantry forward to locate any enemy forces on this side of the river Schniffel, and then protect the main column's flanks as it advanced down the road. The light squadron of the Chevalier Horse Guard of the Grand Army of the Duchy of Soissage was commanded by Captain Coeur de Lice, a pale young gentleman of a poetic temperament. He had dismounted and was stretched drowsily upon the grass, watching his horse eat the daisies and musing on the fleetingness of human existence, when one of his lieutenants informed him that a squadron of pink hussars was heading down the hill at considerable speed directly toward him. Captain Curdelise blinked his clear blue eyes. "Is that so?" he inquired. "And what is the usual military procedure in such circumstances?" The lieutenant had studied military doctrine and replied that a key role of the light cavalry was to neutralise the enemy's light cavalry, and on that basis the standard procedure would be to countercharge. "Well then," said Captain Curdelise, "I suppose that is what we had best do." He climbed astride his horse, the bugles sounded, and the light squadron charged up the hill into the onrushing pink hussars. Meanwhile, the buttercups and the sharpshooters had emerged from the fields surrounding Chateau Chevretin. On the right, the buttercups then continued to advance in column parallel to the road, but on the left, Captain Totenkopf spotted the light infantry company of the 2nd Fusiliers lurking behind Fossel Forest, and ordered the sharpshooters to form line prior to advancing on them. The Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz now sent Colonel Toltot back to the head of the column to order Captain Galuska to advance slowly up the road and shield the advance of the artillery. He did so, and the Grand Marshal and the artillery followed. The light infantry company of the 2nd Fusiliers was commanded by Captain Baguette. Seeing the sharpshooters emerge from the hedgerows of Chateau Chevretin, he ordered his men to advance toward them, and, seeing the sharpshooters forming into line, ordered his men to do likewise. This was a standard parade ground manoeuvre, and his men performed it to perfection. The two lines of light infantry faced each other, just out of musket range. Captain Totenkopf had been here before. He ordered his men to advance on the Soissageois, firing at will. The Soissageois returned fire, but they had no experience of firing at moving targets, or at targets that fired back, and so their fire was somewhat ineffective. While this had been going on, Captain Bickever and Captain Curdelise and their men had been having a fine old time, shouting, slashing at each other with sabres, and milling around dramatically, as only light cavalry can. The battle ebbed and flowed. But the men of the light squadron were discovering for the first time that, although it all sounds very glamorous in theory, receiving a sabre cut in practice is at best painful and at worst fatal. This caused their enthusiasm to wane. One by one they edged out of the fight and started to fall back. This was not an orderly withdrawal, nor was it a disordered mass rout. Rather, the light squadron slowly melted away, leaving the field to the pink hussars. Captain Galuska had noticed the advance of the light infantry company of the 2nd Fusiliers. His orders were to shield the advance of the artillery, and so he sought permission from Colonel Toltot to lead his men to the left, to cover any attack on the cannon by the light infantry. The request was granted, and the first squadron of the pink hussars advanced in column towards Captain Baguette's men. The cannon continued to advance along the road, covered by the pink hussars on the left and the buttercups on the right, to within range of the massed ranks of the 1st and 2nd Fusiliers standing beyond the bridge. At this point, the Grand Marshal ordered the battery to halt and the cannon to be unlimbered. Captain Galuska's concerns proved to be misplaced. Rather than threatening the Harrietten artillery, the light infantry company of the 2nd Fusiliers started to lose cohesion and fall back, as the accurate fire of the sharpshooters took its toll. Although the threat was neutralised Captain Galuska did not want to miss out on the action. On his own initiative, he ordered his squadron to charge into the wavering light infantry. The gallant Pink Hussars responded to this order with alacrity. Colonel Taltot swore at the receding back of his subordinate, but the enthusiasm of the pink-clad horsemen galloping past him was infectious. He spurred his horse and joined the charge. Concealed within Faysal Forest, the light infantry company of the 1st Fusiliers had observed the first squadron of the Pink Hussars move away to the south, and the Harrietten artillery advance and prepare to open fire down the road. This light infantry company was commanded by a certain Captain Savant, who was a diligent student of military literature. He had studied the Battle of Tripod Farm and, in particular, the battlefield effectiveness of naval cannon when used against massed ranks of troops. He decided that his duty required that he do something to prevent the 6-pounder cannon of Harrietten coming into action, and ordered his men to advance toward those guns. Colonel Radek observed the white line of light infantry emerging from the forest, and ordered his men forward to form a firing line and to protect the artillery. Captain Savant's light infantry were now faced by two threats, and, choosing to first deal with that which was most familiar to them, they charged into the buttercups, leaving the artillery for later. Neither the 1st Company of the 1st Regiment of Kleinplatz Light Infantry nor the Light Infantry Company of the 1st Regiment of the Fusiliers of the Grand Army of the Duchy of SOISSAGE had previously seen combat. But Colonel Radek had trained his men for fighting, and they had learned the lessons that the 2nd and 3rd Companies of Buttercups had been taught at the Battle of Lump Farm. The Soissageois light infantry had only been trained for the parade ground, and although Captain Savant had read many military periodicals, he had never even met anyone who had seen action in an actual war. So, once again, it was the forces of Soissage that were bested and started to fall back. Because of the manner in which the units had come together, it was the left wing of the Soissageois that had come to close quarters with the Kleinplatzers, leaving the Soissageois right wing largely unengaged. As the left wing recoiled from the buttercups, the right wing found itself isolated, but still largely unscathed, directly in front of the Harrietten artillery. As the buttercups started to pour fire into the retreating left wing, the Soissageois right wing began to fire on the artillery gun teams. The gun teams wavered. This was the decisive moment of the battle. Sitting astride his horse, amid a hailstorm of musket balls, the Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz exhorted the gunners to hold firm and load their guns with canister. And the gunners did hold firm, and the guns were loaded, and then fired. The resulting carnage was terrific. The tattered remnants of the right wing of the Light Infantry Company of the 1st Regiment of the Fusiliers of the Grand Army of the Duchy of Soissage turned and fled down the road, followed by those of the left wing who had survived the musket fire of the buttercups. On the other side of the forest, the Light Infantry Company of the 2nd Regiment of the Fusiliers of the Grand Army of the Duchy of Soissage was faring no better. Those of them who were still in a condition to do so were fleeing incontinently from the sabres of the 1st Squadron of the Pink Hussars. The Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz ordered the cannon to reload with shot. As a target, he selected the Duc de Soissage and his staff officers, who were surveying the scene from a position in front of Fromage Farm. The 6 6-pounder cannon roared, and 6 6-pound cannonballs flew in the Duke's direction and bounced past his ears. Unharmed, but somewhat disconcerted, the Duke adjusted his physical location so as to interpose the buildings of Fromage Farm between his person and the guns. The commander of the 2nd Regiment of the Fusiliers of the Grand Army of the Duchy of SOISSAGE was Colonel Cedersange. Observing the location of the Harrietten artillery and the fall of its shot, he concluded that he and his men were within range of the guns. He too was a reader of military periodicals, and he too had thereby obtained an understanding of the likely effect of cannon fire on the massed ranks of the 2nd Fusiliers. Deciding that this theoretical knowledge was sufficient to his current needs, and that it was unnecessary to seek a practical demonstration, he ordered his men to fall back. Observing this, Captain Bickever led the 2nd Squadron of the Pink Hussars down from Chevretin Hill towards Fromage Bridge. Captain Goluska ordered his bugler to sound the recall, regathered the 1st Squadron of the Pink Hussars around him, and headed back toward the road. The Duc de Soissage surveyed his position. It was unfavourable. He concluded that Colonel Cedersange had the right idea, and that it was time to make an orderly, tactical, but relatively hasty withdrawal. But while he did so, he needed to prevent the forces of Harrietten from crossing Fromage Bridge. He called the heavy squadron forward. If the Pink Hussars tried to cross Fromage Bridge, the heavy squadron was to charge and drive them back. The remnants of Captain Savant's company were now streaming over Fromage Bridge and up the road past Fromage Farm, pushing through the heavy squadron, thinking only of flight. The Harrietten 6-pounders roared again, and cannonballs started to skip and bound through the ranks of the 1st Fusiliers. Seeing death and panic on all sides, the heavy squadron began to edge back up the road, away from the bridge. Captain Bickever was rapidly approaching Fromage Bridge. He could see that the Grand Army of the Duchy of Soissage was in disarray, and urged his men onward. Observing this, and scenting an opportunity for more excitement, Captain Goluska also ordered his men to gallop toward the bridge. Colonel Toltot again cursed at the receding back of his subordinate, and again joined the charge. All this time, Captain Zerbo and the 3rd Squadron of the Pink Hussars had been waiting on the left wing. They had watched the light company of the 2nd Regiment of the Fusiliers of the Grand Army of the Duchy of Soissage being shot to pieces by the sharpshooters and then cut to shreds by the 1st Squadron of the Pink Hussars, and had not found it necessary to intervene. But, seeing the 1st Squadron galloping forward, Captain Zerbo ordered his men to do likewise. All 3 squadrons of the Pink Hussars were now charging towards Fromage Bridge. The Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz ordered the cannon to keep firing and charged after them. The 1st Fusiliers decided that they had now had enough first-hand experience of cannon fire and started to fall back. On the other flank, the 2nd Fusiliers accelerated their retreat. The Duc de Soissage abandoned his strategy of an orderly and tactical withdrawal. Accompanied by the heavy squadron, he rode away from Fromage Bridge, back up the road toward Soissage. Captain Bickever and his men were therefore completely unopposed as they thundered over Fromage Bridge and up to Fromage Farm, where they encountered a few straggling light infantrymen who were drawing breath after their flight. As the other 2 squadrons of Pink Hussars galloped over the bridge, these light infantrymen were swept aside, and all 3 squadrons of Pink Hussars with Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz now in the van, rushed up the road in hot pursuit of the heavy squadron and the Duc de Soissage. The Duc de Soissage had not had much of a head start, and the Pink Hussars were a fast lot. Hearing the massed hoof-beats behind him, the Duc de Soissage pulled up his horse and turned back. He waited, alone, in the middle of the road, the ranks of the heavy squadron drawn up behind him. The Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz raised his hand, and the Pink Hussars halted and formed into ranks behind him. They considerably outnumbered the heavy squadron. The two leaders rode toward each other. "It appears that you have bested me again," said the Duc de Soissage, and handed his sword to the Grand Marshal. On the Duke's right hand glittered a large signet ring, an ancient ring, the ring that was used to seal official documents, the ring that symbolised sovereignty over Soissage. "And your ring, please," said the Grand Marshal. "But," protested the Duke, "that is the ducal ring of Soissage." "I am aware of that," said the Grand Marshal, "but, as the Duchy of Soissage is now in my possession, I think it is only fitting that I should also possess the ducal ring." The Duke removed the ring from his finger and passed it to the Grand Marshal. Thus ended the Battle of Fromage Bridge, and thus ended the War of Frau Brown's Cow.